Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi, Herman and Corn. So one of the things that I really like about the type of episodes we frequently produce in this podcast, and the reason that I find it so interesting to use AI research to dig into things like the Iranian ballistic missile program and even matters of intelligence, is because these topics are, for obvious reasons, naturally kind of hard to find out about through traditional methods. But it speaks to the power of open source intelligence that we can synthesize information in the public domain, maybe from previous contexts or different context, and sort of try to extrapolate it to create a realistic picture of what might be happening in a current operational environment. And in that spirit, I'd love to delve deep into something that we read all the time in headlines, like many of the things I think we talk about in episodes, is trying to dive a little bit deeper. The turn of phrase that we'll commonly read is that a military has shifted to its highest level of preparedness. Sometimes some countries, especially post 9/11, have popularized the context of having these national alert levels that are communicated with citizens. But we don't typically get information about what a specific rating on that perceived threat level actually translates to in terms of actions. Likewise, when we read in the news that a military has been put on maximum preparedness, we don't get a detailed breakdown, for obvious reasons, of exactly what that entails. And that's what I'd love to chat about in today's episode, Herman and Corn, again, extrapolating from what we might know from other situations. We have, as we've been chatting in previous episodes, this kind of simmering conflict between Iran and Israel happening, with the US moving an armada of ships and other military assets into this region, and it's kind of unclear exactly what's going to happen. But needless to say, we've read, and I read yesterday, that the IDF is at maximum preparedness. So again, Herman and Corn, when we read these things in the news, if we were sitting inside the Pentagon or the Kiryat here in Israel, and there was some kind of a level that was moved to maximum, what does that translate to in terms of actual actions when a military senses that a war might be at hand or an enemy attack is at its most likely? What are the series of actions that the military might use in order to shift its preparedness to the maximum possible level ahead of any potential conflict? Herman and Corn, let's talk about levels of preparedness and maximum preparedness in today's episode of My Weird Prompts.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and I am sitting here in our living room in Jerusalem with my brother,
Herman Poppleberry, reporting for duty. It is a bit of a heavy atmosphere outside today, Corn. I think that is why our housemate Daniel sent us this particular prompt. He was asking about something we have been seeing in the headlines constantly over the last 48 hours.
Yeah, the phrase highest level of preparedness or maximum alert. It is one of those terms that sounds very serious and intimidating, but for most of us, it is just words on a screen. Daniel wanted to know what actually happens behind the scenes. When a military says they are at the highest level of readiness, what are the literal physical steps they are taking in that moment?
It is a fascinating question because it involves everything from high-level satellite intelligence down to the literal grease on a tank tread. People often think of it as just a button you press, but it is more like waking up a giant, complex organism that has been dozing. You do not just open your eyes. Every cell in the body has to start firing at once.
Right, and I think we should start with the framework. Most people are familiar with the American system, DEVCON, which stands for Defense Readiness Condition. But every military has its own version. In Israel, where we are right now, the terminology is often focused on alert levels for specific fronts, ranging from level alpha to level delta. Herman, let us break down that first layer. When the alert goes out, what is the very first thing that happens in the command centers?
The first thing is the transition of authority and communication. In peacetime, a lot of military bureaucracy functions like a corporation. There are meetings, there is paperwork, there is a clear chain of command that moves at a measured pace. When you hit maximum preparedness, that structure collapses into what we call a war footing. The command centers, like the curious underground bunker known as the pit, go into 24/7 operation. Every seat is filled. The continuity of government protocols are activated. This means that if the main command center is hit, there is a secondary and a tertiary site ready to take over instantly.
And that is not just about having a spare room, right? That is about data mirroring.
Exactly. Every scrap of intelligence, every troop movement, every radar blip is being synced across multiple secure locations. They are also hardening their communications. In peacetime, you might use standard encrypted satellite links. At maximum readiness, you start looking at redundant, low-tech backups like buried fiber optics or even high-frequency radio bursts that are harder to jam. You assume the enemy is going to try to take out your internet and your primary satellites.
So that is the brain of the operation. But let us talk about the muscle, the human element. This is where it gets very visible for the public, especially here. We are talking about mobilization.
This is the most disruptive part of the process. When a military moves to this level, they start the call-up of reservists. In Israel, this is the famous Zav Shmoneh, or Order 8. We are talking about tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, receiving an automated text message or a phone call that says, leave your job, leave your family, and get to your base immediately.
And it is not just the people who are in the reserves. Even for the active duty soldiers, the highest level of preparedness means the end of all leave. If you are on a weekend pass, you are back. If you are in a training course, the course is cancelled and you are back with your unit. There is a term called stop loss that the United States uses, which basically means even if your contract was supposed to end today, you are not going anywhere.
And once they get to the base, the logistical nightmare begins. Imagine trying to feed, clothe, and arm 100,000 people who all showed up at the same time. At maximum readiness, the YAMAC, or emergency storage units, are opened. These are massive, climate-controlled bunkers where thousands of tanks, armored personnel carriers, and trucks have been sitting in storage. They have to strip off the protective grease called cosmoline, check the fluids, load the ammunition, and get these vehicles moving toward the front lines.
I remember reading about the maintenance cycles for those stored vehicles. It is not like they just sit there rotting. They have teams that rotate through them year-round. But there is still a massive difference between a tank that is in deep storage and a tank that is ready to fire its main gun in 30 minutes.
Absolutely. One of the specific steps at the highest level of readiness is the priming of weapon systems. In peacetime, for safety and maintenance reasons, you do not keep missiles fully fueled or warheads mated to their delivery systems. At maximum readiness, that changes. If you are talking about an air force, the ground crews are working in shifts to ensure that every single fighter jet is armed, fueled, and what they call hot. This means they are ready to scramble in under 5 minutes. They might even have pilots sitting in the cockpits on the tarmac, just waiting for the word.
That brings up a great point about asset dispersal. If you are at the highest level of preparedness because you expect an attack, the last thing you want to do is keep all your expensive planes and tanks in one big, easy-to-hit base.
That is a critical step that people often miss. You will see aircraft being moved from major air bases to smaller civilian airfields or even specially reinforced sections of highway. You spread your assets out so that a single strike cannot wipe out your entire capability. The same goes for fuel and ammunition dumps. You start moving supplies out of the central warehouses and into smaller, hidden caches closer to where the fighting might happen.
It is like a giant game of shell games, but with multi-million-dollar hardware. Now, let us pivot to the intelligence side. We talked about the command centers, but what are the eyes and ears doing differently when war is imminent?
The intelligence community shifts from long-term analysis to tactical, real-time monitoring. Every available satellite is tasked to the specific area of concern. They are not just looking for big movements. They are looking for what we call indicators and warnings. For example, is the enemy moving their own fuel trucks? Are they clearing civilian hospitals? Are their top leaders going underground? In 2026, this also involves massive AI-driven pattern recognition, scanning millions of social media posts and commercial satellite feeds for any anomaly.
And it is not just visual intelligence. There is a huge surge in electronic intelligence, or aligned.
Right. They are scanning the entire radio spectrum. If they suddenly see a massive spike in encrypted communications from the enemy's frontline units, that is a huge red flag. They are also looking for the silence. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing an intelligence officer can hear is nothing. If a previously chatty unit suddenly goes radio silent, it often means they have received their final orders and are moving into attack positions.
That is chilling. It is the quiet before the storm. But there is also the offensive side of electronic warfare that happens during this phase. If you sense an attack is coming, you might start preemptively jamming certain frequencies or deploying cyber tools to degrade the enemy's ability to coordinate.
Exactly. At the highest level of preparedness, the cyber teams are on full alert. They are looking for intrusions into their own power grids and water systems, but they are also ready to flip the switch on their own offensive capabilities. It is a very delicate dance because you do not want to trigger the war you are trying to prepare for, but you cannot afford to be caught off guard.
This brings us to a really interesting psychological point. Maximum preparedness is as much about deterrence as it is about actual combat. By showing the enemy that you are fully mobilized, that your planes are in the air, that your reservists are at the border, you are trying to convince them that the cost of attacking is too high.
It is a signal. It says, we see you and we are ready. But the danger, as we have seen many times in history, is the spiral of escalation. If I mobilize because I think you might attack, you might see my mobilization as a sign that I am about to attack you, so you mobilize in response. Suddenly, you have two massive armies standing toe-to-toe, and all it takes is one nervous soldier or one misunderstood signal to start a catastrophe.
That happened in the lead-up to World War I, right? The mobilization schedules were so rigid that once the trains started moving the troops, the politicians felt like they couldn't stop them.
Precisely. In the early 20th century, mobilization was a matter of railway timetables. Once you called up the reserves and put them on the trains, you couldn't easily turn them back without causing total chaos. Today, it is more flexible, but no less intense.
Let us talk about the civilian side for a second, because that is what we are seeing here in Jerusalem. When the military hits maximum readiness, it ripples out into the civilian world immediately.
It has to. In a modern state, the military and civilian infrastructures are deeply intertwined. One of the steps is the coordination with emergency services. Fire departments, hospitals, and police go on high alert. You see the opening of public bomb shelters. You see the testing of the early warning sirens. In Israel, the Home Front Command starts issuing very specific instructions through their app telling people to check their safe rooms, or mamads, and to ensure they have 72 hours of water and dry food.
And then there is the economic impact. If you call up 300,000 people from their jobs, the economy slows down. Construction sites go quiet, tech offices have half their staff missing, and consumer spending often drops because people are worried. It is a massive national sacrifice.
It really is. And there is a limit to how long you can maintain that level of preparedness. You cannot keep 300,000 reservists away from their lives forever. You cannot keep pilots sitting in cockpits indefinitely. Eventually, you either have to go to war or you have to stand down. That is why the highest level of preparedness is usually a very short window. It is a state of extreme tension that has to resolve one way or another.
So, Herman, if you were sitting in the Kiryat and the order came down for maximum alert, what is the one thing you think would surprise people the most about that environment?
I think people would be surprised by the sheer amount of checklist-driven activity. It is not like a movie where everyone is running around shouting. It is actually very methodical. There are literal binders and digital databases that say, in step 1, call these 10 people. In step 2, move these 5 batteries of missiles. In step 3, verify the fuel levels at these 20 locations. It is a massive, pre-planned script that they have rehearsed dozens of times in exercises. The professionalism is what keeps the panic at bay.
That makes sense. The script provides the structure when the world feels like it is falling apart. But I want to dig into a more technical aspect that you mentioned earlier, which is the arming of the weapon systems. Specifically, the logistics of ammunition. Most people don't realize that moving ammunition is one of the hardest parts of military readiness.
Oh, it is an absolute nightmare. A single tank can carry maybe 40 shells. If you have a battalion of 50 tanks, that is 2,000 shells. Each of those shells weighs a significant amount and is essentially a highly volatile explosive. You cannot just throw them in the back of a pickup truck. You need specialized transport, specialized handling, and you have to do it all while trying to remain hidden from enemy drones and satellites. At maximum readiness, the supply lines become the most important thing on the map. If the ammo doesn't get to the guns are just expensive paperweights.
And it is not just the big stuff. It is the small things. It is the batteries for the night vision goggles. It is the medical kits for the individual soldiers. It is the spare parts for the trucks that are going to break down the second they leave the paved roads. The highest level of preparedness is essentially the world's most high-stakes inventory check.
That is a great way to put it. It is also about the rules of engagement, or ROE. This is a very specific step that happens at the top level. The political leadership has to decide, and the military leadership has to communicate exactly what a soldier is allowed to do. Can they fire if they see an unidentified drone? Can they fire if they see a troop movement across the border? At the highest level of readiness, those rules usually become much more permissive, which is part of what makes the situation so dangerous.
Right, because you want your soldiers to be able to defend themselves if an attack starts, but you don't want them to be the ones who accidentally start it. It is a terrifying responsibility for a 20-year-old on the border.
It really is. And speaking of the border, another physical step is the clearing of minefields or the setting of new ones, the positioning of portable bridges, and the clearing of obstacles. If you think you are going to need to move forward, you start preparing the paths. If you think you are going to be attacked, you start building berms and digging trenches. You are literally reshaping the landscape to your advantage.
We have been talking about this in a very general sense, but let us look at some specific examples from history. Think about the 1973 Yom Kippur War. That is a classic case of a failure in the preparedness cycle.
Exactly. In that case, the indicators were there. The Egyptian and Syrian armies were moving, they were calling up reserves, they were doing all the things we just talked about. But the Israeli leadership misread those signals as just another exercise. They didn't move to the highest level of preparedness until it was almost too late. The reservists were called up while the first shots were already being fired. It was chaos. That trauma is exactly why today the military is so much more sensitive to those indicators. They would rather mobilize and have it be a false alarm than wait and be caught off guard.
It is the cost of being wrong. If you mobilize and nothing happens, you lose some money and everyone is tired. If you don't mobilize and an attack happens, you could lose the country. That is the calculation they are making every single day.
And it is a calculation that is getting harder because of technology. In the past, you might have days or even weeks of warning as troops move by rail or sea. Today, with hypersonic missiles and cyber warfare, the warning time can be measured in minutes. That means the highest level of preparedness has to be even more responsive. You have to be able to go from 0 to 100 almost instantly.
Which brings us back to the automation and the pre-planned scripts. You can't have a committee meeting when a missile is 3 minutes away.
No, you can't. A lot of the systems now, like the Iron Dome or the newer Iron Beam laser defense systems, have automated modes. At the highest level of preparedness, the humans are basically just there to monitor the computers and hit the override if something goes wrong. The machines handle the split-second decisions of intercepting incoming threats.
That is a bit of a scary thought, but I guess it is the reality of modern warfare. Herman, let us talk about the second-order effects. We touched on the economy, but what about the psychological effect on the soldiers themselves? Being at maximum readiness for days on end must be incredibly draining.
It is called alert fatigue. You can only stay at that peak level of adrenaline for so long before you start making mistakes. Your senses dull, your reaction times slow down, and your judgment becomes clouded. This is something military commanders worry about constantly. How long can we stay in this crouched position before our legs start to shake? If the tension drags on for weeks without a resolution, the readiness actually starts to decline.
So, you have this paradox where being too prepared for too long actually makes you less prepared.
Exactly. You see this in the maintenance of the equipment too. If you are running your jet engines on the tarmac for hours every day just in case you need to scramble, you are burning through their service life. You are creating mechanical wear and tear that wouldn't happen in peacetime. It is a depleting state of being.
That is fascinating. It is a reminder that preparedness is not a static thing. It is a process that consumes resources and human energy.
And it is also a process that involves a lot of deception. While you are showing the enemy your strength on one front, you might be quietly moving your real strike force to another. Part of the highest level of preparedness is the implementation of what we call maskirovka, or military deception. You might create fake radio traffic or move empty trucks to trick the enemy's intelligence into looking the wrong way.
Like the Ghost Army in World War II, with the inflatable tanks.
Exactly. We have much more sophisticated versions of that now, involving electronic signatures and cyber decoys, but the principle is the same. You want to be prepared, but you also want the enemy to be confused about exactly how you are prepared.
So, to summarize for Daniel and for everyone listening, when we see those headlines about highest level of preparedness, we are looking at a massive, multi-layered synchronization of human, mechanical, and digital systems. It is the call-up of the reserves, the dispersal of aircraft, the priming of missiles, the hardening of communications, the mobilization of civilian emergency services, and the activation of complex pre-rehearsed scripts.
And it is all happening under a cloud of immense psychological pressure and the constant risk of accidental escalation. It is a state of being where the entire nation's resources are focused on a single, terrifying possibility.
It really puts the news into perspective. It is not just a phrase. It is a total transformation of how a country functions.
It is. And I think it is important for us to remember the human cost of that transformation. Every one of those reservists is a person who had to drop everything. Every one of those commanders is carrying the weight of thousands of lives.
Well, Herman, I think we have covered a lot of ground here. From the underground bunkers to the tank treads to the psychological strain. It is a sobering topic, but one that is very relevant to our lives here in Jerusalem right now.
Definitely. I hope this gives Daniel and our listeners a clearer picture of what is actually happening when they see those alerts on their phones.
Me too. And before we wrap up, I want to say thanks to all of you for sticking with us. We have been doing this for over 600 episodes now, and it is your curiosity that keeps us going.
It really is. We love digging into these weird prompts. And hey, if you're enjoying the show, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and join our little community.
Yeah, it makes a big difference. You can find all our past episodes and a contact form if you want to send us your own weird prompt at myweirdprompts.com. We are also available on Spotify and wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. We will be back soon with another deep dive.
Stay safe out there, everyone. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.